Yes, so next we will have a presentation by Professor Ross Brown, who's the Dean of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London. And he's an academic from a professional background in theatre practice. And something worth mentioning would be, in this context, also the book that George was also referring to, Sound Reader in Theatre Practice, which can very well be described as groundbreaking, and also in that sense it's working in practice that hardly any of our theses go without a few mentions about Ross's book. So please welcome Ross Brown.
Thank you very much. Okay, oh, it's working, good. So yes, space. We've been lots and lots of talk about space today, and I've been thinking about space whilst I've been listening to everybody else's presentations, and especially the questions at the end, the deathly, the anxious, tense space of no questions, and the anxiety of the host of the session, willing questions, and so. Don't worry if you've not got any questions at the end, it's not an issue. But I did quite like the question, where do you live? So you can ask those questions. What my favourite colour is, what my favourite food is. Any questions will be good at the end, but also equally, no questions is also fine. Because hopefully I'll answer them all. So space and me. Starting with me, I suppose. Jari has described me as an academic from a professional background. I suppose actually my main job at the moment, the space that I inhabit on a daily basis is an institutional space. I'm the dean of a big drama school in London. I say big, 1,000 students. It's a college of the University of London, and it's one of London, or the UK's old drama schools. There's us and Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, both started around the same time in the early 20th century. So it's about a 110-year-old drama school. And we train people for the theatre industry in the UK. And I'm just going to say a little bit about that, because this space that I've inhabited is sort of what I'm going to be talking a little bit about. I'm standing in front of a slide that says 1986 and all that, so obviously this is a time space as well. This is a space that stretches back a little bit into the past, but I'm aware that a lot of you may not be familiar necessarily with the UK theatre scene, so and it's very different from the Finnish theatre scene. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. I jotted some notes down this morning whilst I was listening. So we've got 1,000 students at Central. 300 of those approximately are actors of different kinds. So we have 3 undergraduate acting courses. One of them is a traditional sort of, if you want to say, classical acting course, acting for screen and films, and they get agents at the end of it and they go and become professional actors. We've got a musical theatre course as well for actors, and we've got something called a collaborative and devised theatre course, which does that. It trains actors to work in a collaborative and devised environment. And about 300 of our 1,000 students are designers, production students, scenographers, of various kinds, and we do lots of very, very specialist courses that feed into specialist roles in the industry. I use the word industry. It's a strange term. Some people, when they hear the term industry, think of big chimneys and machines and things like that, but in the UK it is a big industry theatre. I pulled some stats off the internet this morning. Last year, or a year recently, it wasn't quite clear which year this was, 60,000 performances of 5,000 separate professional productions in the UK. 5,000 professional productions. 33 million theatre visits in the UK last year. 1.03 billion pounds taken at the box office in the UK theatre industry. That's more footfall than the whole of the Premier League football. So theatre is a big industry. And Central is one of those, if you like, those trade schools, those schools along with RADA, and there's about 3 or 4 other big schools that train people to work in those industries. And we have specialist courses in all manner of different specialist production roles. So what we call scenic art, I know you mentioned scenic art earlier, what we call scenic art is scenic painting. And that feeds into a role of scenic art, scenic painter. We have scenic constructors. We have designers who design costume and set. We have lighting designers, and we have production lighting students, which are 2 separate roles. We have 2 separate courses. And since 1994, we've had a theatre sound design course, because theatre sound design around that time had become a role, a small role in the theatre, which needed training. So that's what we do, but we don't just train people for the industry as it is. Part of our role is also to shape the future of the industry by training professional practitioners who can go and do that work, but can also innovate and can also move theatre forward, because theatre is a bit fragile at the moment. The same survey that I was referring to a minute ago with all those stats about footfall and box office also revealed that of all those, whatever I said, 5,000 separate productions, and that those 33 million theatre visits, there's a disproportionate amount of those which is in musical theatre. Musical theatre has become a huge part of the theatre industry. And also the audience is ageing. The average audience in theatre in the UK is getting older and older. And there's a risk here. Theatre has to be sustainable. So the people that we train at Central have to go and change that industry, make it relevant, keep it interesting, keep live theatre as something that is this big cultural force that it's always been in the UK. On the positive side, in 2013, new writing, new productions overtook revivals. So there's a lot of new work being made in the UK. It's not just become a heritage, sort of, let's do something a bit old-fashioned and go to the theatre. There is a lot of interesting new theatre being made. But I think it is characteristically quite different from the sorts of theatre that exists in lots of continental European countries, where professional theatre does perhaps tend to be characterised by something that is more performance-based, more experimental, more innovative. There's lots of theatres in London which are traditional proscenium arch theatres, curtains, seats, gilt boxes, all those kinds of things. So that's my job. I run that place. I used to be the sound design tutor. I was the guy that started that sound design course in 1994. But then about 2002, I moved up into senior management, and now I'm the dean of the whole school. So I oversee all of those students and all of those courses, and I'm responsible for the overall academic strategy of the school and moving that forward. So that's the space that I currently inhabit. And I want to riff a little bit now on space. And I'm actually going to come down here a second, because I've got a PowerPoint. So there's going to be a sort of show within a show. I'll do the PowerPoint in a minute. But this is a sort of post-PowerPoint that I wrote during the course of the morning. So these are my slides, but you can't see them. So I'm going to pass them round, actually, so it's interactive. I'll read them out, and then you can pass them. So you'll get to touch my PowerPoint, and then maybe somebody could show them to the camera at the end so that they're captured. So the first slide says, listening to the performances last night in this space, I was aware that I was hearing them in many other spaces behind the various spaces that were being conjured in this room. Pass that around. So I want to talk a little bit about an expanded concept of the auditorium. I talk a lot about theatre spaces, but I'm a sound person. When I sit in a theatre, I'm sitting in an auditorium. That's my base room. The auditorium is the space where I've spent more hours than I care to remember in the dark, hunched over a console, waiting normally for the lighting designers to get their programming done. So let's think about what an auditorium is, and I just want to propose a sort of expanded concept of an auditorium. I propose that it's not just an acoustic room for listening. There's actually lots of meta spaces, lots of different spaces. I started off by talking about, if you like, an institutional space that I inhabit, and to a certain extent, that space that I inhabit is always one that's with me, whatever theatre I'm in, because I work in that role. So that institutional space that I inhabit in my job, where I'm thinking of training people for the industry and the future of the theatre industry and all of those things, it's around me all the time. It's part of the, orally I'm in that too. It helps me, or it rather affects the way I hear, because I think I'm listening probably for different things, partly because I inhabit that institutional space, where I'm training sound designers, where I'm trying to think all the time about what sounds interesting, what sounds old-fashioned, what sounds innovative. So it's directing my attention. It's changing the way I hear things. So an auditorium might also have this institutional meta space. For me, I know most of you probably aren't deans of drama schools, so you might not have that institutional space, but you'll have your own institutional meta spaces too. There are the more obvious spaces that comprise the auditorium. There's the acoustic space, obviously, which is the one we all learn about in terms of standing wave frequencies and reflective surfaces and absorbent surfaces and all of those kinds of things. But then there's the staged space, the space that we're creating, that we're staging as part of the performance, part of the show. And that can have acousmatic elements, so there's a space beyond. There's a space of an unseen beyond. An acousmatic space that's heard, but actually it's a space beyond the one that we're actually inhabiting. Then there's the electroacoustic space that overlays the acoustic space, and that's a different space too. And there's dialogue between the electroacoustic space of the speakers and the acoustic space of the room. And then there's the electroacousmatic space, which is the space of the sound effects or the music that are being played through the electroacoustic field of the loudspeakers. So there's that space too, which is subtly different from the acoustic acousmatic stage space. You see where I'm going? Lots of different spaces. But there's more. There's also an imaginative or mnemonic space. By mnemonic space, I mean a space that's to do with the memory. So when I'm sitting in an auditorium, listening, trying to pay attention to what's happening on stage, being distracted by all these other spaces that I'm inhabiting, there's also a space of what I'm imagining, what I'm thinking, what I'm following, the dialogue and the stories that they're invoking. I'm imagining different spaces. And I'm perhaps remembering spaces. And the imagination and the memory very closely linked in the mind. And we were hearing about Don Eder earlier, the phenomenologist who has a whole section in his book about the auditory imagination and the space of the auditory imagination, which is worth reading actually, because it has acoustic and aural properties. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm going to talk a bit about Complicité's show, The Encounter, which I think makes fantastic use of imaginative and mnemonic space. So there's the imaginative and mnemonic metaspace. Then there's also, I think, a personal space, which is slightly different. And that's the space of one's close body. So when you're in the theatre, I think you have a heightened awareness of your own physical presence, because there are conventions and behaviours about being in the theatre. And they can differ according to the different sorts of genre of theatre that you're in. So last night in this space, it was okay to wander around and to talk to people, because that's the kind of gig it was. You know, it wasn't a theatre where you have to sit still and be quiet and try and stifle your coughs or not breathe too heavily. And not sniff or fart. I mean, you could, I didn't, but you could. I may have done. So there's that personal space, and that's a space that is sort of governed by one's own sense of propriety and by convention and by all those social dynamics as well. So that's a close bodily space, if you like, the the distance whereby you think, well, actually, if I make a sound, somebody near me might hear it. It's also an internal space. There's an internal body space. You're aware of rumblings in your tummy, and you're aware of swallowing and sniffing. You have an internal soundscape too. And then there's that sort of interpersonal space, the space between you and the other bodies in the room. And that's a space that's inscribed with all sorts of different tensions, but it's also an oral space. It's a little bit like the one I was talking about, the propriety of me not coughing or me not sniffing, or there's the same. There's the sort of slight affront you feel if the person behind you is snoring. So there's that sort of interpersonal space, the space of social manners, if you like. These are all part of what I would describe as an extended auditorium. There are yet more spaces. In fact, I'm not going to list them all. There's loads of them. You'll be able to think of other spaces that you carry around or you sit in when you're at the theatre. One of them is a space of sort of historical tradition and convention. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. If you go and see an opera, you're in you might be in a theatre where they do plays and they do operas, but the room that you're sitting in when you're seeing an opera is a different one to the room that you'll sit in when you're watching a theatre performance. There's a different history and a different set of conventions because of the genre of that kind of performance. I've talked a little bit about institutional space as well, but there's an institutional space around theatres too. So I think a fringe theatre is very different from the National Theatre or the Royal Opera House. It's a different space. And there's the space of orality. I suppose all of these are spaces of orality, but spaces of how we hear and the sounds we produce by wanting to hear them. So I have these. I go to the theatre and I really hope I'm going to hear something really good. I really want to hear a certain kind of sound design. I'm listening for a certain kind of sound design. And that affects what I do hear. Okay. I'm going to come on to this PowerPoint in a minute. I'm getting there. There's another one. This is quite interesting, actually. It's an economic and sort of consumer space, too. It's the space of work, of leisure, of the perceived value for money or artistic value of the theatre. So this is another kind of space. Is this as good as it should be? Is it as good as I paid for? Am I getting my money's worth? Is it worth the evening I'm spending here rather than the evening I could be spending watching Game of Thrones at home? All of these are spaces that we inhabit. And I would say that these are all part of an extended auditorium. All of these things affect how we hear, the way we hear, what we hear. Might sound tenuous, and some of these are very, very subtle. But I think all of these things inflect and nuance the sound that we experience. Obviously, they don't affect the acoustic activity in the room. That measurable energy isn't affected by any of these things. But that's not sound. That's just measurable acoustic energy in a room. The sound, what the sound means, how it affects us, that space, that notion of the auditorium, is affected by all of those metaspaces. So that's just a prelude, really. And on the first one I sent around, I put a little asterisk by auditorium, and that's my definition of an auditorium. Auditorium just isn't a room. An auditorium is an instrument of agency for hearing. It's an instrument that enables us, conditions, plays a role in the sound that we hear and that is made, or that we make by listening to it. So that's partly me, actually. I think there's another space I'm in here, which is me as an academic of sound, trying to move myself forward to thinking about sound in a slightly different way. I've spent a lot of time since 1994 thinking about what theatre sound is, the history of it, the practices of it, what it means, its relative status amongst all the other areas of theatre practice. And now I think I've slightly moved myself on, perhaps because of my position now, in both within Central and as somebody that's now become relatively well known as a sound academic. I'm just trying to think of sound in a different way. And the way I'm thinking about sound now is in terms of this extended notion of an auditorium, the space that makes the sound. I'm not even going to think about the sounds too much. I'm just thinking about all these different meta spaces within which we produce the sounds that we hear. Okay, that's the prelude. I'm going back on the stage. So this is the presentation. 1986 and all that. This is the space of nostalgia. And another space I'm in, that of being very aware that I'm another middle-aged white man standing in front of you. And that's another space, actually, that I inhabit at Central, because one of the things I think that theatre really needs to do is diversify the kinds of people that stand on these platforms. But hey, I am another middle-aged white man. 1986 and all that, I was less middle-aged back then. 1986, so yeah, 30 years of vast, but actually 1986 isn't a bad point to start thinking about 30 years of sound design. I mean, it's impossible to say when something begins, because there's always the conditions that brought that thing into being, and how far do you go back? Theatre sound design as a term, I discovered when I was researching the book, was probably first used in 1956 by David Collison to describe work he was doing at the Lyric Theatre at that time, but then wasn't used again in relation to drama, in relation to what is sometimes called conceptual sound design or sound effects design for many years after that until the late 60s, and became a term that was mainly used for musical theatre sound design. And those of you that are as old as me will remember that some would say that sound still needs explaining, sound design still needs explaining in theatre. But if we go back to 1986, it really did need explaining. A lot of people had no sense of how sound could be designed, because design was something you did with pens and pencils on a page. Maybe, yes, maybe you could possibly extend that notion to saying, yeah, you can design light, because you probably did that with pens on a page, and But design was something that was held to be equivalent to draftsmanship and to arranging things on a two-dimensional surface. So I think 1986 is probably not a bad place to start with, the history of where we are now in terms of sound design. I'm going to talk a little bit in this talk, and as you can already tell, it's quite personal, about this 30-year history of sound design. I'm going to focus, as I've just implied, on the role of the professional conceptual sound designer, for want of a better term. But really, I'm meaning not musical theatre sound design, not that kind of sound design. Although there is a big overlap, and I wouldn't want to think there's a clear binary between conceptual sound design, the designing of sound effects, and musical theatre sound design, because there isn't a clear divide. Good musical theatre sound design still has to respond to dramaturgy, and it still has to respond to telling the stories in ways other simply than making the musical instruments and the singers sound louder. But let's just focus on, if you like, conceptual sound design for drama, which might involve music, obviously, but I don't mean musical theatre. Okay, a little bit about me. Sorry, me. But this is really by way of telling the story of theatre sound design since 1986 in the UK. So 1986, I graduated from art school. I wasn't trained in theatre sound design because there wasn't any training in theatre sound design. In fact, I had no interest in theatre whatsoever. I think I'd been to the theatre a few times as a kid to see pantomimes And that was about it. I think maybe we got taken to see the RSC at school, and it bored me absolutely rigid. And once to see a Harold Pinter play at the Old Vic, which I subsequently discovered as a legendary performance. But again, it bored me rigid. I had no particular interest in theatre. 1986, coincidentally, George was talking about, mentioned Paul Arditi a couple of times. Paul Arditi we'll come back to. I don't know how many people are familiar with Paul Arditi's work or with his name, but Paul Arditi is probably one of the top sound designers in the world. And he's an old mate of mine. I knew him from the early 80s when we were both students. He was a student of drama at Hull University. I was a student of fine art in Newcastle, both in the north of England. In 1986, I moved to London, and Paul had been working at an old repertory theatre in Farnham in Surrey. And this was, I don't know if you know English repertory theatres, they did a different play. In those times, it was a different play every 3 weeks, I think. So there'd be the same company of actors who would perform the play in the evening and be rehearsing the next one during the day. Quick turnaround of set. And Paul was, having graduated from Hull University, I think in 1984, was a sort of general technician in the electrics department. And I remember going to see him at Farnham quite a lot, and it was an amazing, if you could call it a sound mixing position, which it wasn't, you wouldn't recognize it today. It was behind glass. There were still gramophones in there. Sound effects were taken off gramophone records, played back normally on reel-to-reel tape, but you couldn't hear them through the glass. It was all coming through this tiny little show relay speaker. But Paul, like me, this had been a point of our friendship, was an audiophile, was interested in sound. I'd always been interested in sound. My dad was one of those 60s and 70s hi-fi buffs who had his own Revox machine and expensive Spendle speakers. And this was our sort of rather nerdy point of contact, me and Paul. We liked sound. And this is around this time, the National Theatre was one of only 2, I think, theatre companies in the country that had a dedicated sound department, and Paul wanted to work in it. He was desperate to work in it. He always knew exactly what he wanted to do in his career, whereas I really had no clue. To the extent that he heard that the National Theatre cricket team were going to be playing the Redgrave Theatre cricket team. Paul can't play cricket at all, but I can. So he said, Ross, will you come and play for the Farnham cricket team? So I've got an excuse to come along to the match so that I can hang out with the people from the National, which he did. And that's how he got the job at the National. So I do claim all of his success as being down to me. So 1987, with no experience of theatre myself, I was offered a gig. I was painting away in my studio in the East End of London, playing the role of the artist in his garret. And a mate of mine, different mate, who was also at university with Paul, said, I've been operating this show in Edinburgh. It's won a Fringe first, which is one of the prizes they give to the best shows on the Fringe in Edinburgh. It's got an Arts Council funded tour, but I can't do it. I've got another job. His other job was working for another new company at the time called Theatre de Complicité, who paid slightly more. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll pick that one up for you. So he showed me. I turned up to the last night at Edinburgh, and he said, look, there's these 2 Revox machines, there's this mixer, there's a guy on stage there, he's got a DX7 synthesizer, there are 2 mics, and somebody plays saxophone over there. One showed me the show once, gave me the cue sheets, and then off we went on tour. I was operating it, having to learn how to set the tiny little sound system up, a couple of speakers, rolling the cable out, gaffering it down. That was my introduction to theatre sound. And with the on-stage musician, a guy called Adrian Johnson, I sort of learnt about how that worked, about how to get the levels right, how to balance the levels of the music with the spoken dialogue, how to ride the faders to build the energy, about how theatre sound actually was different from doing gig sound for music. started to learn what I would later call something of the sort of dramaturgy of sound operating in that instance. Now, such was the time then that, because there was no training for sound designers, what there was a couple of drama schools like Central that had stage management courses that did a bit of technical sound design, and if you went to your job and your rep and you were given the sound design, the theatre sound brief, that would normally just mean taking sound effects from records, splicing them onto reels of quarter-inch tape, and then hitting the go button where it said go in the script. There weren't really many sound operators around, apart from a few musical theatre sound operators, who tended to be old rock and rollers. But around this time, in 1987, there was something happening in theatre. There was more demand for theatre sound operators who could come in and work with sound effects and with underscoring, and have a sense for that, have a sense of timing for the cues, have a sense of levels, have a sense of how to make this work. So, having had no real ambition to work in theatre, I suddenly found myself going from one job to another. My next job after this tour was a West End musical with radio mics and all these things I had no clue about. And then a big touring musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, with a rock band playing 2,000-seaters. No training, no experience, but there was nobody really around that could do it. And it wasn't rocket science. It was small numbers of radio mics. It was a few speakers, left and right. It was the sort of thing you could figure out if you had a good ear for it. And the good ear was the important thing. So then, this is me still, 1988 to 1994. I alternated between doing this quite well-paid theatre sound operating, big musicals and West End shows, often working for Paul, who was sound designer, operating his shows, and then doing my own work, which was more at I'd say the nexus of musical scoring and sound design. Including silent films, I had a great gig underscoring, playing live sound and music for silent films, including once here at the Festival of the Midnight Sun up in Sodankula back in the late 80s, early 90s. That was a fantastic gig, but one that really, really developed my sense of dramaturgy, of the dramaturgy of sound. Performing a live score to a silent film where everything was minutely cued from visible actions on the screen, where you had to build vectors of tension, and you had to take audiences up and bring them down and work with and against and across the editing structure of the film. Fantastic way of learning how to work with sound and music in this kind of sort of filmic underscoring way, which was all the rage at the time. Did that for a while. 1994, sort of slightly got sick of touring because it was all touring, and saw an advert in The Guardian for a sound design tutor to start a new deep degree course in sound design at Central, which I took. 1996, cutting forward now, I was introduced to colleagues from VAS who visited us in London to have a look at our program, and then invited me back to Tampere, where I did a project with some people who are in this room. And that was the beginning of my relationship with the Theatre Academy. A 20-year relationship, terrifying. One of my first students was mentioned earlier, Gareth Fry. He was in my first graduating cohort in 1996. 2002, I stopped teaching and became head of studies and then dean. And 2002 to the present, colleagues now run the sound program at Central. Greg Fisher, who's now retired, and now Donato Wharton's the sound tutor. He's a composer and sound designer, has worked a lot with Robert Lepage. Is that fireworks? Worked a lot with Robert Lepage and Katie Mitchell. Very interesting young sound designer. And hopefully, I'm going to try and see if he can get out here and have a look at what's happening at VAS, because I think it's really interesting if anything, if last night is anything to judge by, then I think that actually we've got quite a lot to learn from what's now happening at VAS. very impressive stuff. Most of my job now is leading Central. So that's across all of those subject areas, but I do still occasionally write and present on theatre sound. Right, that's enough about me. Let's talk about professional theatre sound, again, back in 1986. As I said, the RSC and the NT have sound, the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre have sound departments, but it's a rarity. Back then, only one book on theatre sound in print that I was aware of, Stage Sound by David Collison, lovely, lovely man, still with us. Brought out another book on theatre sound a couple of years ago, which if you haven't seen it, it's published by Plaza, it's a big hardback, fantastic, get it. Also, the first person ever to be called a sound designer in 1956. Back then, 1986, theatre sound was, as I described before, technical support. It was regarded as part of the technical service department, if you like, of theatre, which serviced the artistic vision of the director and writer. Nothing wrong with that. That's what it did. Director and writers, they were the authors, they were the creative people at the top table, and their ideas got put on stage, and so lots of conversations in sound departments around that time were about things like honouring the text, these strange words, honouring the text, or trying to, if the director couldn't articulate it properly, trying to interpret the director's vision or the writer's vision. Quite often, directors back then, and even some now, had difficulty articulating what it was they wanted to happen with sound. So it was quite often about interpreting what they might want. As I say, nothing wrong with that, but it was a creatively hierarchical structure. There was little scope back then for what I would call a plastic relationship between the sound and the dramaturgy. The dramaturgy was there, it was something that was in the script, it was something that that was there in the director's concept, and the concept that was discussed between the director and the designer and the actors around the table at the read-through. And the sound slotted in where it said dog bark, where it said door slam, where it said, the sound of an explosion, whatever it was. There was little scope for a plastic relationship between those two things. There was a little scope for the sound technician to start suggesting, well, maybe the sound could do something else here. Maybe the sound could go against that or underscore this. At that moment, actually, previously in theatre's history, there were moments when sound did do that, where that plastic relationship between sound and the dramaturgy was there. If you go back to the 19th century, actually there was a lot of really interesting sort of creative stuff that was happening in that relationship between sound and the dramaturgy, that was happening in melodrama, particularly late melodrama. If you're think of things like sort of Gothic horror and those kinds of things. Theatre went very quiet in the earlier part of the 20th century. Back to 1986, sound design itself a contested term, I mentioned that, had been used by Collison in 56, but mainly the preserve of musicals, many struggled to grasp the notion. 1986, Les Miserables opened with the Midas desk said to cost more than the average UK house. So this was also the 1980s era of the beginning of the mega musical. It was Thatcher's Britain. It was the Britain of yuppies and big money and flamboyant expenditure. But this was in musical theatre of Cameron Mackintosh, of Andrew Lloyd Webber, very much part of that culture of Thatcher's Britain, ostentatious, opulent wealth, loads of money on the show. But something was happening, something was starting to stir. People wanted to work more with sound, but it was frustrating. Because of two things, really. Working with sound was cumbersome in rehearsals. It tried the patience of directors, particularly in compressed UK production schedules. So this is partly a product of that rep system I was describing, but the standard rehearsal period of a professional play in the UK was 4 weeks if you were lucky. 3 weeks sometimes, and then you're in the theatre for the 4th week, teching, doing the production week. 4 weeks and the 5th week, if you were lucky. So rehearsal time was scarce. Not a lot of time for rewinding through spools and spools of tape to get back to that sound cue, to try it again. Or to get the editing block out, splice the tape, change the order of the cues around if you needed to do that. Or hop in a taxi, go across town to Autograph Studios and re-record a sound cue if it wasn't quite right. It was cumbersome, and consequently, it was cut all the time. Sound was cut. Frustrating. People wanted to use more, it was just difficult. Stylistically, things were changing. This was the 80s. There was a trend for what I now think of as a sort of new melodrama, a multimedia melodrama, which was sort of in keeping, if you think about it, with the sort of new romanticism of the 80s. This new melodrama of what we referred to then as designer theatre or physical and visual theatre. There was a new Gothic, lots of revivals of Nosferatu and Gothic Victorian, Edgar Allan Poe stories, those kinds of things. There was a real appetite for this new melodrama. It was visual, it was gestural. It involved music, underscoring, and sound. It was also filmic. There was, I mean, I think this is overplayed. I think people talk a lot about the 80s as being a time when people were trying to stage movies, stage movie soundtracks. And yes, there was something of that. But I do think that there was this sort of turn in the 80s in theatre towards this new Gothic melodrama, this new romantic kind of designer theatre. So people wanted to use more sound, but it was difficult. So you did get, rather than sound, you did tend to get live musicians, live composers, playing with synthesizers, playing with found musical instruments, working in the rehearsal room, because that could be quicker. After the sparse naturalism of the earlier part of the 20th century that I referred to earlier, you know, the sort of Pinteresque pauses, the silent theatre with the very occasional but symbolically significant sound effect, there was now more of an appetite for more underscoring and more symbolic use of sound. It's a little bit about the technology. I think in the past, I'll come back to this, I've been slightly guilty, I think, of downplaying the technology, partly because I think in my pedagogy I've always been trying to dissuade students from becoming too obsessed with the technology. But it was important, and I think actually the delight of technology was always part of sound design. So these are some postings. I put a thing on Facebook in the Association of Sound Designers group. For any sound designers who were working in 1986, what were you working with? This was 1989, but there you go. Tech heads about you. You can see M1, SY77, I had one of those. DX7s all over the place, an Amstrad PC. Cassettes. We were using cassettes all the time. I know lots of people, it's like, how can you, what about the quality? What about the hiss? Well, we used them, it was great. Porter Studios, these 4-track cassette recorders, wonderful things. This is Mick Poole, who's still around, head of sound at the West Yorkshire Playhouse for a long time. That's his gear. Soundcraft 800B, 2 Revox PR99s, he was lucky he had the professional ones, and 2 A77s. The SPX90, fantastic multi-effects unit, one of the first affordable multi-effects units that we could use, and really push to its limits, using these infinity delays and almost using it like a looping sampler on occasions. And as he starts to describe there, you know, the cumbersomeness, the loading up of four act 2 tapes, rewinding them to the beginning, zeroing the counters, all of this manual setting. It was, and no automated desks, having to write a paper plot of every setting on the desk, write down that value on a little, normally you have these templates with all the little pots recreated, and with a little pencil you put where the line was, so you knew how the desk was set. So you did a reset and you could set it back. You see, you kids, you don't know you're born. But this is the interesting thing. I'm going to come back to this, I think, at the end, when I'm going to make a bit of a provocation to you kids. For the audience, things didn't look that much different to many plays today. This is Mick Poole still speaking here. 6 UPAs on the pros, a couple of subs under the balconies. And he talks about the home studio, etc. But I think that's interesting. From the audience's perspective, still look pretty much the same. And this even more interesting, if it's true, and I think it might be. The scale and ambition of sound design in 1986 was as complex and sophisticated as it is today. It just took a lot longer and required meticulous planning and a lot of ingenuity. The big difference that there was no internet, so all research had to be done from books and libraries. Music research and sound effects sourcing required days and days of location recording and traipsing from library to achieve what could now be done in 10 minutes. The bit that interests me here, though, is that the scale of ambition of sound design in 1986, Mick Poole suggests, was as complex and sophisticated as it is today. And that might be true. It might not be true in some respects, but I sort of think it is sometimes. Myself, when I go to the theatre to see plays sometimes, I think, yeah, this is really good. This is slick, this is tight, this is accomplished, this is practiced. The sound designer is obviously well trained. But what they're doing here is a really, really good, slick version of what we were trying to do in the late 80s. Maybe there's another new melodrama thing going on. Perhaps there is. There were two distinct sort of areas. I described my career alternating between the big number one tours and then the smaller scale fringe stuff where I was working at this nexus between composition and sound design. And that was, it's still the case in the UK, actually, amongst those 5,000 productions each year. There are the big professional ones, where you hire all the kit from Autograph, and it tours around in a massive articulated truck, and you have whole teams of people fitting it up in a big main house space. But then there's the smaller stuff, the fringe stuff, if you like, what they call in America the off-Broadway. They tried calling it off-West End in the UK for a while, never really caught. This was that scene back in 1986. It was geared around the Edinburgh Fringe, small-scale tours. It was influenced by companies like the Worcester Group, Pina Bausch, Robert Wilson, European Clown and Mime Theatre, lots of people that had studied at École Jacques Lecoq School in Paris, but also by the music of Tom Waits, Philip Glass, Steve Reich. Those were, if you like, the big cultural influences in the 80s for people like me, working on this sort of fringy alternative scene. I would say there was little awareness of the avant-garde sonic art history that people like Douglas Kahn or Mladen Ovodija, I think he's pronounced, who wrote a book recently on post-dramatic theatre and the avant-garde, talk about as in some way being genealogically linked to post-dramatic theatre. Yes, you can start to draw lines between the sonic art practices of the Surrealists or the Dada movement and some of the things that you hear in so-called post-dramatic theatre today. But when so-called post-dramatic theatre was really starting to take shape in the 80s, through the work of people like the Worcester Group and Pina Bausch and Robert Wilson, I don't remember people really talking very much about the sonic art of the Dada movement or the Surrealists. I remember people talking a lot more about cheesy sound effects records or exotica that they'd found on secondhand vinyl, or pop and rock concept albums, or the music of Tom Waits, etc. So I wonder if the sort of the influence of the avant-garde on post-dramatic theatre might have been a little overplayed in recent academic discourses. So these were some of the UK companies doing this work at the time under that influence. These are some of the people that I worked with and for as a composer and a sound designer during the 80s. Glasgow Citizens Theatre, fantastic theatre in the working class area of Glasgow that did really fantastic visual, physical, sonic work for local working class audiences who would walk out at the interval if they didn't like it. One of the most fantastic experiences of my career. Deviate Dance Theatre, Redshift Theatre Company, who did a new melodramatic Gothica. They did lots of horror, lots of murder stories, lots of Victorian adaptations. Brilliant stuff. Small venue, bursting with production value. The Shadow Syndicate, another Edinburgh-based company who toured. Communicado, Shared Experience, and Theatre de Complicité, who I think probably of that list, the one who've endured and are still one of the big theatre companies of the world. I'll come back to Complicité. Now, this is something I think which needs to be factored into any understanding of this period, 1986 and all that, in the UK. It was a product of what I would call dole culture. Now, by dole culture, the word dole means unemployment benefit. It was the case at the time, the UK had very high unemployment, but it was also possible for people like me, graduates, or even when we were students actually, to sign on the dole during our holiday periods and after we graduated and get state money. I used to get £42 a week supplementary benefit for being unemployed and housing benefit. So I used to get my flat paid for by the state if I was unemployed, even though I was a graduate. So I was able to do work that was unpaid or very badly paid, cash in hand work that I didn't have to declare. I was able to do that. And so a lot of these people that started out at that time, almost everybody was hopping on and off the dole perhaps when they actually did have a paid gig, where it was taxed and therefore known about, and then going back on the dole afterwards. So it enabled you to develop an artistic career, which isn't the case now. You can't have that. So I think one has to attribute this moment of the explosion of post-dramatic theatre and of contemporary sound design to that particular moment. The other side, if you like, of Thatcher's Britain. Les Mis and its massive Midas desk over there, dole culture over here, with people like Simon McBurney, myself, others, hopping on and off the dole and enabling ourselves to develop these careers. I mentioned this already, baby boomer popularity. We were all people who grew up in the post-war years of pop culture and pop auditory culture, which the people of, I don't know, Pinter's generation didn't. So we grew up in a busy sonic environment. Our auditorium, our extended auditorium as we grew up, was full of juxtapositions of sound effect and music. Music used as sound effect, jingles, stingers, advertising logos, musical motifs that were being used as sonic stingers, and sound effects that were being juxtaposed with music in pop records, going right back to the sort of late 50s, bubblegum pop, space age pop, early rock and roll, where you think about, the sounds of the motorbike in Leader of the Gang, through to stuff like the Who's album, Who Sell Out, where there's radio jingles, Sgt. Pepper, of course, and then all of those albums where sound effects became intermingled with music, not in the same way that Schaefer had used musique concrète or John Cage had used noise as music, but just for the sort of pop pleasure of hearing a sound effect close up to music. like on the radio, or like in the ad breaks between the TV shows, or like in the soundtrack to your TV Western or your TV kids puppet show, or Warner Brothers cartoons, all those things that we grew up listening to. There was a pleasure in sound effects, a pleasure in the, and we knew they were sound effects. That was the whole point. They were sound effects. You watch a Warner Brothers cartoon, they're not actually suggesting that that's what it sounds like when an anvil falls on the coyote's head. There's a pleasure in that comedic sound effect. I'm going to come back to that a little bit in a minute because I've got more to say on that. So yeah, post-dramatic theatre or a new melodrama, new interest in the Gothic, German expression and symbolism. Silent film, live scores became a new gig, I mentioned that. Not just for me, lots of people were doing silent film scoring. That was almost a new form of theatre at that time. So some of the characteristics of this new way of working with sound. Sound and music on the same palette. Tightly synced to visual cues and scenic structure, whether working with a silent film or with theatre. Working the sound and music from that palette very tightly in rehearsals to those cues. Underscoring visual set pieces, key dialogue and scene changes. So creating moments that were just moments where there was no dialogue. You cleared the stage and it was just a gorgeous moment for the audience to enjoy of music and sound and a well choreographed scene change or just some sort of visual performance, physical movement performance, passage of time, that kind of thing. Artifice and technique often declared and performed on stage. Again, we're not trying to kid you that these sound effects are the real sounds. We're inviting you to delight in these sound effects, to enjoy these sound effects. And part of that sometimes was showing how they were done, revealing, declaring how this sound effect's being produced. So lots of shows, characteristically, between 1986 and the mid-90s, had the sound and the music performed in full view, often in stage. This is the Worcester Group. The Worcester Group, I think, were one of the big influences in this regard. But a lot of the work I did, I would be on stage with all my kit and my, instruments and found junk, or I would work with the actors, and the actors themselves would act their bit, and then they'd go off to the side, and they'd pick up instruments, and they'd be underscoring what their colleagues were doing on stage. A lot of this probably does sound familiar because I do think there's some of this going on again now. Composed and worked in the rehearsal room. So yes, this on the Fringe. Remember we were talking about the Fringe, the sort of off West End theatre here, rather than the big professional stuff, where it was still difficult to get the sound into the rehearsal room because they weren't working in this declared way. But on the Fringe, more and more common to have the sound in the rehearsal room for those 4 or 5 weeks. Often way ahead of the lighting. The lighting would come in and be designed at the end, but the sound and the music in the rehearsal room from the beginning, being worked and rehearsed and devised along with the mise en scène. But this was an obstacle. When the mainstream commercial theatre wanted to try and import some of this style, which started to happen, I think, the beginning of the 90s, really. Jana, when were you at the National? 92. 92 was when Complicité, if you like, stepped up from the Fringe onto the national stage with Street of Crocodiles, which is one of their famous productions. So around that time, this generation of theatre companies started to step up into the mainstream. Fine at the National, they had a sound department. They had the luxury of lots of space and extended timescales. But for the largely freelance, professional commercial industry, this way of working with sound in rehearsal room was an obstacle. And it was really difficult. And when I started to get composing and sound design jobs for commercial producers. I used to have screaming rows sometimes with producers about why I had to be in the rehearsal room from the beginning, and they had to pay me for it. This is a salary, this is a wage bill they'd never had to pay in the past. Yeah, so this is me, this is my contribution to that Facebook conversation. I alternated between bigger scale stuff, smaller scale, Edinburgh BAC work, I also got a lot of value out of cassette Porter Studios, early samplers, DX7. But it was the Akai S1000 sampler that suddenly, I think, changed all of this, because all that cumbersome business of having to rewind, etc., was suddenly solved. If you could get the producer to pay out to hire in an Akai S1000 sampler with its 16 megabytes of RAM, there was a hell of a lot you could do. Sampling music, sampling sound effects, but you could pitch them, you could stretch them, you could loop them. You had random immediate access on a MIDI keyboard. No more rewinding. You could put a pair of headphones in and you could alter cues in the room. You wouldn't have to get a taxi to Autograph. And there were creative possibilities in this tool as well. It was designed to emulate musical instruments. Became really popular with hip-hop music, sampling breakbeats and those kinds of things. But it was flexible. You could easily get inside a lot of these MIDI parameters and abuse them and make them do things that they weren't designed to do. Edit loop, play with the ADSR envelopes, the attack decay, sustain release envelope. Do unintended things with features like velocity zones, which are supposed in the design, the harder you hit the note, the louder it gets, or the shorter the attack gets. But you could actually map anything to those controllers. So you could do some interesting things. You could cluster sounds together on one key. You could have different groupings of sounds. You could track them across the keyboard so they get higher at that end and lower at that end, or you could switch that off so that the sounds were at their original pitch wherever they were on the keyboard. It was a fantastically versatile piece of kit, all on a tiny little LCD screen the size of a matchbox. That's what it looks like, so yeah. You could do all of that. No computer interface there. You were working with these knobs on a little black and white screen. Okay. So I've said this a little bit, but just to recap, I'm going to come on to the curriculum in a minute. How did we know what to do? We weren't trained. Nobody had trained. Some people had gone to music school. Maybe they'd learned how to write film scores, very different from writing music for theatre. Unless you have a sense of that rehearsal room dramaturgy, unless you have a sense of the particular sensitivities around working to the acoustic voice. But we sort of knew how to do. Our ears had been conditioned by the film soundtrack, by TV, by Doctor Who, by Hammer Horror, by cartoons. I'm repeating myself here, but sonic art or avant-garde music, nobody really knew it, other than where it had occurred on film soundtracks. So people knew Ligeti because it had been in The Shining. Sort of knew it when you heard it, but it wasn't really talked about. And we loved sound effects in music. So in 1994, I get the job at Central, and I have to write a curriculum for theatre sound design. There's a stage management course there. It had always done 4 weeks of sound, where you learned how to edit Revox tape and how to go and get a sound effect from the BBC Sound Effects Library. How do you design a sound design course when sound design itself was something that a lot of people just denied existed at all? When I went for the interview there, I was recruited by a sonographer. The head of department then was a designer. And he wanted sound design. His vision was to have sound design as part of this sonography program, alongside puppetry. set and costume design and lighting design. In my interview, he asked me if I knew who Hans-Peter Kuhn was, Robert Wilson's sound designer at the time. I didn't know. I think few people working in the professional theatre sound in England at the time would have known, because UK theatre culture just wasn't connected to that kind of theatre at the time. So I started doing some reading around. There was something of a sonic turn, I think, going on at that time. There was across the arts, there was an interest in sound starting to happen. Books by Whitehead and Kahn, The Wireless Imagination, came out in the 90s. R. Murray Schafer's The Soundscape was reprinted, I think, originally published, I think, in the late 70s, but became commonly available again in the 90s. John Cage's book Silence was reprinted in 94. Dina Kay and James Lebrecht, American couple, brought out their book on designing sound and music for theatre. But the interesting part of that book for me was Peter Sellers' introduction. If you haven't read that, then do. John Bracewell's book, I think maybe you referenced it this morning, it's probably the best book to come out about how to do theatre sound in that sort of how to service the script, how to service the director sense. It was constrained by conventions. So I did a sort of literary survey, if you like, a literary review of what was available, and then really started to have to put together a reading list of just extracts from these existing books that seemed relevant to a sound design curriculum, as we were really constructing one from scratch. When I started, the students had already been recruited, and Gareth Fry was one of them. And Gareth, there was an interesting group, 6 students in my first year of teaching at Central. Gareth had already done a music tech course somewhere and was the studio geek, the studio tech head. And the others were people who they were probably talked into doing sound at their interview. They probably actually really wanted to do set and costume design, but were talked into doing sound because we needed to make the numbers up. So that was interesting, but I think what proved really interesting was the principle of taking people out of their comfort zone, and Gareth not least. So rather than just allowing him to indulge his studio geekery, pulling him out of his comfort zone, having him do sonic art installations, doing what I'd done, performing practical and recorded sound effects for silent films, grappling with sort of rather oblique projects like representing silence. And we were talking about this over lunch. We had him making model boxes to get us to really train his brain to think about space. And he hated doing all that. For the more art school orientated sound designers who'd probably done a foundation course in art design, we made them grapple with soldering irons, and we took them out of their comfort zone in that way. And Gareth, if he were here, would say it did him the power of good, making him cut his fingers with scalpels, making model boxes and do sonic art installations based on silence. In 1986, I brought some of this to Tampere. I came and did a project called 5 Minutes of Sound at VAS, 2-week project. Now, I was amazed when I turned up in Tampere to see the kit that you had. My sound studio back at Central was still these tiny little Soundcraft desks, reel-to-reel tape recorders, samplers with about 2 seconds of sample time. Horrible speakers. I turned up in Tampere, fantastic sound studio. Pro Tools, never seen it before. Absolutely loved it. Genelec speakers everywhere. Never heard of those things before. But I brought the same methodology. It's okay, we're not going to play with this kit. So I got everybody down to little path, this bleak path by a river. I think we chose the space by throwing a dart in a map of Tampere to choose this space. And then we chose a time by some other random method. Right, at 7:30 in the morning, we're going to go to this randomly chosen place, and we're going to take 5 minutes of sound from that time and place, and we're going to make a piece of performance out of it. So everybody turned up. 20 different kinds of microphones were there, people with video cameras, film cameras, and big boom mics, and all sorts of microphones, and notebooks and ears. And 7:30 approached, or whatever time it was, did a countdown, the 5 minutes started. Everyone's listening, waiting. What's going to happen in this 5 minutes of sound? What's going to be our text for our performance? Nothing. Silence. At one point, on the other side of the river, a bicycle went past, squeaking slightly. Faintest sound you could just make out, squeaking of a bicycle. And then, absolute joy, with about 10 seconds to go, a duck landed on the river. And there was a splash. But that was it, that was our text. That's all we had to work with. We took all the tapes back to the studio. How the fuck are we going to make a performance from that? But that was the project. 2 weeks of working with the recordings, and then I think in the end we ended up creating that physically using objects, using things to riff on this squeaky bike, riff on the duck landing. So that was, this is my first memory of VAS. And this fantastic moment where this wonderful woman from, I think the Finnish equivalent of our sort of radiophonic workshop, came along and recorded our performance with binaural microphones in her ears by dancing in the space so that her perspective of the space was changing. It was a very silent, quiet piece. Unfortunately, my DAT tape of that is now unplayable. So if anybody has got any recordings or any of those materials, it would be lovely to find those again. Anyway. So yeah, I think that there was an affinity between what VAS were doing and what we were doing at Central. VAS had more kit than we did. It's a different theatre culture in Finland as well. I mean, I became very aware of this in my relationship with VAS and with friends like Jana over the years. Just a completely different culture of making theatre. Back then it was far more building-based. Theatre, you worked for a theatre. Theatres had big permanent sound installations. Whereas in the UK, most theatres don't. You hire the kit in. Most people are freelance. Unless you work for the National or the RSC, you're a freelancer. So different theatre cultures, different institutions. But there was a shared ambition, I think, in the 90s for sound design to be a theatre art, not to be elevated above the technical, which is not to say that there's anything at all wrong with technicians and being technical, totally. And today, I think more than ever, there's a really valid new role for the production sound technician who just does that, who really just specializes in the technical side of it, because it's got too big and complicated for one person to do it all. But I think the shared ambition between Central and VAS back then was to elevate it, to give sound a permanent seat at the top table of theatre authorship and collaborative innovation, so that it wasn't just the director and the writer and then a family tree that went down with the designer and the lighting, and then the sound was somewhere down here. That sound was part of that initiating conversation at the top of the tree. And that it shouldn't be considered any more a technical art than any other art. All art has its technical side and its technology. I'm getting to the end. My polemical position throughout my career, which I'm reflecting on now a little bit. I've always said to students, I've always said in conference presentations, I remember, again, another one of my early experiences was coming to one of Jana Ovanin's sound seminars on a big boat a big Viking liner between Helsinki and Stockholm. And we had a seminar of sound on this boat. And Paul Arditi was there too. And my paper was anti-technology. I'm not anti-technology at all, but I do think that people can become too comfortable with the technology. It can just become an end in itself. It's not what it's about. Sound happens in the ears of the audience, not in the studio. The audience isn't listening to what you do. It doesn't care how you do it. It really doesn't care. Go back to that statement of Mick Poole's. From the audience perspective, it looks the same. Technical fetishism is a constraint. I'm not sure what I mean by this. Theatre history begs a sonic dramaturgy of the whole auditorium. Okay. This is where I'm getting to now. A dramaturgy of the whole auditorium, the acoustic, the electroacoustic space, audio-visual, silent and noisy, present, remembered and imagined, and all the in-betweens. Okay, this is where I'm getting provocative now, and I'm not going to probably ask you for questions, but you can come and talk to me about this later. I'm starting to get to the point now where I think defaulting to loudspeaker sound at all, as the default, I'm not saying don't use loudspeakers, but as a default position, before you do anything else, putting loudspeakers everywhere. Isn't that lazy? Isn't it just an uninspected habit? Use Foley, use silence, use noise. Consider that sound design might be possible without that electroacoustic space. There are other spatial possibilities. Loudspeaker sound isn't exactly the height of modernism anymore. It was the height of modernism in the 1930s. Where are we now? Academic interest and this sort of transdisciplinary sonic turn, sound studies, the fact that anthropologists, sociologists, cultural theoreticians are all interested in sound, is itself throwing up a new dramaturgy. Directors, performers, musicians, and writers who are younger than me, grew up, who are graduates, have grown up and they've graduated and studied in the era where sound does have a discourse. So I think there's a lot of interest and talk about sound at the moment, but are sound designers leading it, or are they starting to facilitate it again? The more that directors, the more that writers, performers, composers, musicians are becoming sonically literate, have studied and trained in this sort of era of sound studies, I wonder whether or not the sound designers are perhaps slipping back into being responsive rather than leading. Have the demands of programming and networking now become as cumbersome in their own way as the rewinding of the tape? I see this at Central quite a lot. It seems sometimes in time-pressured situations that the burden of having to program and reprogram desks, and perhaps because the students are learning and they're not quick at it yet, but I wonder sometimes whether defaulting to this technology automatically is necessarily a good idea. Those who are leading the innovation, I'm using Gareth Fry again, but there are plenty of others. And Serge was talking about this morning. They're doing it because they're great collaborators, not because they're great technical geniuses. Gareth is a technical genius, but Gareth is one of the leading sound designers in the world because he's a great collaborator. He listens, he understands, he's articulate. He hasn't got a huge ego. I don't know how many of you have seen or are aware of The Encounter, which is Complicité's latest show, which Gareth designed. It's a binaural show, but it's a seated binaural show for 700 to 1,000 people. It performed at the Barbican. It's on Broadway at the moment. Every seat in the auditorium has a wired pair of Sennheiser foam high-quality foam headphones. And on stage, the performer, Simon McBurney, there's a dummy head, a Sennheiser dummy head, there's a mono microphone, there are loudspeakers, there's a whole sort of sound studio set up, which the sound design team talk of in terms of an ontology. They're starting to talk in the sort of gaming terminology of, you know, where we might once have talked about the dramaturgy of the show, they're now talking about the ontology of the systems of the shows that produces the meaning and produces the sound. But this show is about space. It uses an explanation of the binaural effect and binaural technology as its narrative. And it takes you into and explains and describes the space where it's fantastically clever. The mono microphone is explained to sound in the center of your head. Remember, everybody's listening to this through headphones. So the performer will demonstrate the mono microphone as being the sound that becomes the center point of the stage in the middle of the head. And he describes that as being close to the seat of consciousness, to the voice of the internal monologue. So he's creating a sound center stage right close. Go back to what I was talking about earlier about the personal space, your personal space. He establishes center stage being near the seat of your consciousness. Then he describes the left-right stereo. The music that they use, which is played in the underscoring music, is left-right stereo. And he describes that as being a line between the two ears with the presence of your left ear, presence of your right ear, and points along that line. So as an audience member, you're starting to construct a theatre space in your head. He's given you a centre stage near the voice of your consciousness, his voice, the voice of the narrator. That's where you're hearing that. It's close to the point where you think and you remember. And then there's a musical framing, a left-right stereo that goes along a line between the left ear and right ear. And then he explains the binaural dummy head, and he explains this projective space that comes as a result of that technology. And that becomes the space of the scene, the scenic narrative that goes back in time, that goes forward in time. You see him using the space, you hear binaural recordings that take you into the past. It's a show that radically, in my view, reimagines the auditorium. Everybody wearing headphones, and yet they're light headphones. The actual space of the auditorium, the room that you're in, is important. It's not negated by the headphones. There are bass bins in the space. He uses bass bins to give that visceral vibration. But also they're light foam headphones. You can hear people coughing. But all of the sound from the stage is in and around your head. But there's always this close visual link between the two. It's playing with an auditorium that we're familiar with. And increasingly, going back to what I was saying about the sort of existential crisis that theatre faces because of its aging audiences, if it's going to engage new audiences, it really does need to engage them in these kinds of auditoria that respond to their orality. And the orality of the next generation of theatregoers is going to be one that has largely been conditioned by heavy headphone use and by inhabiting this close personal space. So it's a radical reimagination of the auditorium, and I think it's significant because it's the kind of radical reimagining of the auditorium that I think will create radical and imaginative new theatre forms that might help theatre survive and not just become a conservative heritage art form. And I was impressed by his team. Gareth's got a team of about 6. There's 4 operators on the show, playing the music in live, doing all sorts of various things. And they did a presentation of this in the Barbican Auditorium. Each one of that team was able to talk intelligently and articulately about the process, about this ontology, about the concept, about what was going on. Really blew me away. But that's the exception. Generally speaking, is Mick Paul Wright. Is the scale of and ambition of sound design no greater today than it was in 1986? Did we just get quicker and more automated? What values to the audience or the art that it's easier to reset and cue and you don't have to do all of those things with pencil? Or that the sound you're hearing is DDD? They didn't mind when it was on cassette. It's better in DDD, but there's more to it than that. Has theatre sound design lost its mojo? We were motivated by them, back then, because we wanted to do something that was difficult, because we had this baby boomer orality. We wanted to do something more with sound as part of this new romantic melodrama. What's theatre sound design wanting to do at the moment? What's motivating it? On the one hand, we've made progress. So Paul Arditi is now a director of the National Theatre. A sound guy is now one of the senior directors there. I'm going to speed up here. This is what Rufus Norris says about him. So, institutionally, theatre sound has now made it. We have a professional association of sound designers. It's starting to become a viable profession with a pension and all those kinds of things. But the Tony Awards, the panel still didn't know how to judge sound design. Didn't know how to judge it. They didn't know how to make a value judgment about whether it was good or bad. So they dropped the Tony Award for sound. That's a whole can of worms. I'm not going to talk about wholly reinforced perspex box drama, but there's a thing there too. Experimentations with portable, wearable, interactive sound, headphone and VR theatre. With the exception of the Encounter, they've remained in the academic and experimental fringes for too long. This stuff has been around for a long time. In places like VAS, I think, which has always done far more experimental and innovative work in performance than the commercial UK theatre industry has. But why isn't it stepping up onto the main stages like Complicité did in 1992 with Street of Crocodiles? Why is it taking so long for this kind of post-dramatic stuff to step up into mainstream drama? Just recently, you may have heard about this, you may not, the Globe in London. Shakespeare's Globe, the one on the South Bank. It had a radical, this is their statement. The Globe was reconstructed as a radical experiment to explore the conditions within which Shakespeare and his contemporaries worked, and we believe this should continue to be the central tenet of our work. With the realization of Emma's vision has been a vital part of our continuing experimentation as a theatre, we have now concluded that a predominant use of contemporary sound and lighting technology will not enable us to optimize further experimentation in our unique theatre space and the playing conditions they offer. So they dropped lighting and sound from the Globe. Interesting. But on the one hand, I think that's fine. Historically informed, traditional Shakespearean production is going to be of interest to some people, that's fine. But it made me think, and by way of a provocation, I'm going to end now, I promise. I just thought about that press release by the Globe. Isn't this true more generally? Theatre should be a radical experiment to explore the conditions within which people live, love, and work. A predominant use of 20th century sound and lighting technology will not enable us to optimize further experimentation in our unique theatre spaces and the playing conditions which they offer. And going back to my opening thing about the extended auditorium, let's think radically about that. Let's think radically about whether or not necessarily filling our auditoria with this 20th century technology, the height of modernity in the 30s, is the way forward. I'm going to leave that on the screen. That's my final question. What will motivate sound design in the next 30 years? I've gone over, but thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ross. And the coffee is looming back there, so that we have perhaps time for a couple of short comments or questions if you have one. Something that interests me is there anyone present who was doing this 5 minutes of sound back then in Tampere? Janne
Yeah.
and Jokke there. So how was your recollection, or is your recollection of that project?
Well, I wasn't actually working. I was sort of like co-running the project, but I think Jokke might have something to say about the project more as a student.
I don't think you can remember it.
As we were actually talking earlier on a lunch, we talked yesterday on the bar about a little bit about this, and I had kind of forgotten about it, the whole course, and actually there's a lot of things that I think I have forgotten about those years over Tampere. And when we were talking, all those I started remembering the course, and I don't know. I think I can say is that I had a good memories coming back about that, but it was kind of it was good experimentation, and what we were saying on stage now when you were talking about, I think those feelings. Oh shit! This is silent. What we do, and we were doing a little bit things like that with. We had some guy called Jone Takamäki, who's still actually in VAS. We're doing things like that, doing live sound acoustics things, performances. But sorry, no good recollection of that.
Made a deep impression, obviously. It
No,
was
it's
20,
not- it's not
it was
that.
20 years ago. I know.
Yeah,
I know.
seriously,
I
it's
can
not
hardly
that.
remember it.
Yeah. But
Okay.
thanks for that.
Yeah.
Black.
Okay. Let's all head towards a cup of coffee. Thank
Thank you very much.